December 18, 1944. Winston Churchill sat in his map room at 10 Downing Street staring at casualty reports from Operation Market Garden. Montgomery's ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas had failed catastrophically. British and Polish airborne troops were slaughtered at Arnhem. The ground advance stalled, over 10,000 Allied casualties for minimal gains. Meanwhile, reports from the Third Army showed Patton's forces racing across France, taking cities, destroying German divisions, advancing so fast the supply lines couldn't keep up. Churchill's chief military advisor, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, stood nearby. He knew what was coming. The Prime Minister was about to make one of his characteristically blunt assessments. Churchill lit a cigar, studied the maps, and said something that would never appear in official records, but would be whispered among staff officers for years. Montgomery requires an army. Patton requires only a map and gasoline. This single sentence captured the fundamental difference between Britain's most celebrated general and America's most controversial one, and it explained why the Allied advance across Europe became a story of two completely different approaches to war, one methodical and cautious, one aggressive and relentless. This is the story of what happened when those two approaches collided, when Montgomery's careful set-piece battle cost thousands of lives and accomplished little, when Patton's aggressive exploitation took cities faster than maps could be updated, and what Churchill really thought about both of them. Montgomery, the methodical general. Bernard Law. Montgomery was Britain's most famous general, victor of El Alamein, commander of British forces at D-Day, meticulous planner, careful executor, the man who'd stopped Rommel in North Africa. Montgomery's approach to warfare was based on several principles. Overwhelming superiority at the point of attack. Never attack until you have material and numerical advantage. Build up forces, supplies, and support before committing. Careful planning. Every detail considered, every contingency planned, no improvisation, stick to the plan. Minimize casualties. Britain had lost nearly 1 million men in World War I. Montgomery was determined not to repeat that bloodbath. He'd rather wait and plan than attack and lose men unnecessarily. Set-piece battles. Prepare the battlefield like a stage. Position forces exactly where you want them. Then execute the plan methodically. This approach had worked at El Alamein in October 1942. Montgomery spent months building up forces, stockpiling supplies, and planning meticulously. When he attacked, he had overwhelming superiority. Rommel's Africa Corps was defeated. It worked at Normandy. Montgomery's careful planning ensured the D-Day landings succeeded, despite terrible odds. But Montgomery's methods had serious drawbacks. Slow advance, waiting for perfect conditions, meant German forces had time to prepare defenses, bring up reinforcements, and organize resistance. Missed opportunities. When German forces were disorganized and retreating, Montgomery's caution allowed them to escape and reform defensive lines. Resource intensive. Montgomery's battles required massive amounts of supplies, artillery, and support. This diverted resources from other operations. Inflexibility. When plans went wrong, which they often did in war, Montgomery struggled to adapt. He'd rather stick to a failing plan than improvise. By September 1944, Montgomery's caution was becoming a strategic liability. Patton, the aggressive opportunist. George S. Patton Jr. was everything Montgomery wasn't: profane, aggressive, improvisational, driven by instinct as much as planning. Patton's approach to warfare. Speed and aggression. Attack before the enemy is ready. Keep attacking so the enemy is always reacting, never organizing. Exploit success immediately. When minimal planning, basic plan, aggressive execution, adapt on the move. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Attack with what you have. Accept calculated risks. Some casualties are inevitable. But aggressive advance prevents more casualties than cautious defense. Exploitation. When you break through enemy lines, don't stop to consolidate. Pour forces through the gap and destroy the enemy's ability to organize defense. This approach had worked spectacularly in Sicily in July 1943. While Montgomery's 8th Army advanced methodically up the east coast, Patton's 7th Army raced across western Sicily. Patton took Palermo while Montgomery was still fighting through defensive lines. It worked in France after the Normandy breakout. Patton's 3rd Army advanced so fast across France that it outran its supply lines. Cities fell before German commanders knew they were threatened. But Patton's methods had drawbacks too. High risk. Aggressive advance could lead to encirclement if the enemy counterattacked exposed flanks. Supply problems. Fast advance outran logistics. Patton's tanks literally ran out of gas because supply trucks couldn't keep up. Coordination difficulties. Other Allied commanders struggled to coordinate with Patton because his plans changed constantly based on opportunities. Personality conflicts. Patton's aggressive style and abrasive personality created friction with other commanders, particularly Montgomery. By September 1944, these two approaches were about to collide. September 1944, the critical moment. September 1944. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. German forces were retreating in disorder. The Wehrmacht appeared to be collapsing. Eisenhower, commanding all Allied forces in Europe, faced a critical strategic decision: how to finish the war. Two options were on the table. Montgomery's plan, Operation Market Garden, a concentrated thrust through Holland into Germany's industrial Ruhr region. All Allied resources focused on one massive attack. Montgomery promised to end the war by Christmas. Patton's plan, broad front advance, multiple armies advancing simultaneously across the entire front. Keep pressure on German forces everywhere so they can't concentrate defenses anywhere. Aggressive exploitation of any weakness. Eisenhower had to choose, or more accurately, he tried to do both, which meant neither got adequate resources. Montgomery argued passionately for his plan. One concentrated thrust. All available supplies and air support. Punch through Holland, cross the Rhine, seize the Ruhr, end the war. Patton argued just as passionately for his approach. Give him gasoline and he'd be in Germany within weeks. Don't stop to plan elaborate operations. Keep the pressure on while German forces were disorganized. The argument reflected fundamentally different philosophies of war. Montgomery believed in the decisive battle. Concentrate overwhelming force at one point, break through, exploit that breakthrough to win the war. Patton believed in continuous offensive. Never let the enemy recover. Attack everywhere. Exploit any success. Keep the enemy off balance until they collapse. Eisenhower made his decision. He approved Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. It would launch on September 17th. But he didn't stop Patton completely. The Third Army could continue advancing, just with reduced supplies and support. This decision satisfied no one and would lead to disaster. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's gamble. September 17, 1944, Operation Market Garden began. The plan was audacious by Montgomery standards. Drop 3 airborne divisions, American, British and Polish, to seize bridges across rivers and canals in Holland. Ground forces, British BSX Corps, would advance up a single highway, linking up with each airborne division in sequence. Final objective, Arnhem, where they'd cross the Rhine into Germany. If successful, Allied forces would outflank German defensive lines and have a clear path to Germany's industrial heartland. Montgomery promised it would work. He had overwhelming air superiority, detailed planning, massive support. But the operation violated several of Montgomery's own principles. It required speed. 1026 Corps had to advance 60 miles in 2 days to reach the airborne troops before they were overwhelmed. Speed was not Montgomery's strength. It required improvisation. When things went wrong, and things always go wrong, commanders would need to adapt quickly. Montgomery's forces were not trained for improvisation. It depended on a single road. If that road was blocked, the entire operation failed. No alternate routes. All forces funneled through one highway. The operation began well. Airborne troops dropped successfully. Initial objectives were seized. 1026 Corps began advancing. Then everything went wrong. The disaster at Arnhem. The problems with Market Garden became apparent within hours. German strength was underestimated. British intelligence reported light German forces in the area. Reality: 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem. Elite troops with tanks and heavy weapons. The single road became a death trap. German forces needed only to block the highway to stop the entire advance. They did exactly that. 1026 Corps got bogged down. Radios didn't work. British airborne troops at Arnhem couldn't communicate with ground forces or air support. They were isolated and surrounded. The bridge at Arnhem was too far. Corps couldn't advance fast enough. The British airborne troops holding the bridge were slaughtered. By September 20th, 3 days into the operation, it was clear Market Garden had failed, but Montgomery refused to admit it. He kept sending forces up that single highway, kept ordering attacks that had no chance of success. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem was surrounded and annihilated. Of the 10,000 British and Polish airborne troops at Arnhem, fewer than 3,000 escaped. 1026 Corps took heavy casualties trying to advance up the highway. American airborne divisions at Nijmegen and Eindhoven suffered significant losses. By September 25th, when the operation was finally abandoned, the casualties were staggering. Over 17,000 Allied casualties total. British 1st Airborne Division effectively destroyed. Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade decimated. Thousands of elite airborne troops killed or captured. What had been gained? A 60-mile salient into Holland that didn't reach the Rhine and didn't outflank German defences. Operationally, almost nothing. Churchill was livid. Patton's rampage, September to December. While Montgomery was planning and executing Market Garden, Patton's Third Army was doing exactly what Patton always did: attacking. Despite being on reduced supplies, most resources were diverted to Montgomery. Patton's forces advanced relentlessly. September 1944, while Market Garden was underway, Patton's Third Army took Nancy, a major French city that controlled crossings of the Moselle River. German defenders expected methodical siege. Patton's forces attacked immediately, took the city in 3 days. Fortress Metz, considered impregnable, was surrounded. Patton didn't have resources for a proper siege, so he bypassed the main fortifications and took the city from the rear. By October, Patton's forces had crossed into Germany itself near Trier. First, American forces on German soil. November. Third Army advanced into the Saar region, took Saarburg, Merzig, and multiple smaller cities. December, before the Battle of the Bulge interrupted everything, Patton's forces had taken portions of the Siegfried Line, captured thousands of prisoners, and were advancing into Germany proper. The contrast with Montgomery was stark. Montgomery's Market Garden, planned for months, and massive resource allocation, 17,000 plus casualties. Minimal territorial gain. No strategic objectives achieved. Patton's advance, same period. Minimal planning. Reduced resources, most went to Montgomery. Moderate casualties. Advanced over 100 miles. multiple cities captured, crossed into Germany. Churchill received these reports simultaneously. Montgomery's disaster, Patton's success. The comparison was impossible to ignore. Churchill's private assessment. Churchill didn't publicly criticize Montgomery. That would damage Allied unity and British morale. Montgomery was a national hero, the victor of El Alamein. But privately, Churchill was furious. His chief military advisor, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, recorded in his diary Churchill's growing frustration with Montgomery's caution and tendency to overpromise and underdeliver. Churchill's famous comment, "Montgomery requires an army, Patton requires only a map and gasoline," captured his assessment perfectly. Montgomery needed everything perfect before attacking: overwhelming forces, massive supplies, air superiority, artillery support, detailed planning, and even then, he'd advance cautiously, consolidating after every gain. Patton needed a map showing where the enemy was and gasoline to get there. He'd figure out everything else on the move. Churchill had another observation that he shared with his inner circle. Montgomery is always preparing for the last battle. Patton is always fighting the next one. Meaning, Montgomery's careful planning was based on lessons from previous battles. He was trying to avoid past mistakes, but war doesn't repeat itself exactly. By the time Montgomery was ready to attack, the situation had changed. Patton improvised constantly. He adapted to current conditions, not past battles. This made him more effective in fluid situations. But Churchill also understood Montgomery's value. In set-piece battles where careful planning was possible, like El Alamein or the Normandy landings, Montgomery excelled. When the situation required meticulous preparation and overwhelming force, Montgomery delivered. The problem was that by late 1944, the war had changed. Germany was collapsing, the situation was fluid. Opportunities appeared and disappeared quickly. This was Patton's kind of war, not Montgomery's. The numbers don't lie. Let's look at the actual statistics from September to December 1944. Montgomery's operations: Liz Market Garden, 17,000 plus casualties, 60-mile advance that didn't achieve objectives. Scheldt Estuary, clearing Antwerp approaches, 12,873 casualties, strategic success but high cost. Total, approximately 30,000 casualties. Territory gained: portions of Holland, Antwerp port access. Major cities captured: Antwerp already captured, Montgomery cleared approaches. Patton's Third Army, same period. Total casualties: approximately 15,000. Territory gained: advanced over 100 miles into France and Germany. Major cities captured: Nancy, Metz, portions of Saarbrücken, multiple smaller cities. German forces destroyed. Estimated 50,000 plus killed/captured. The contrast is striking. Patton achieved more with fewer casualties and fewer resources. But there's context that matters. Montgomery faced stronger German opposition in Holland. The terrain favored defenders. His objectives were strategically important but difficult. Patton faced retreating, disorganized German forces in many areas. His advance benefited from German collapse after Normandy. Fair assessment: both commanders succeeded and failed in different ways. But Patton's aggressive approach was better suited to the fluid situation of late 1944. The personality clash. Montgomery and Patton despised each other. This wasn't professional disagreement, this was personal animosity. Montgomery considered Patton a reckless cowboy who took unnecessary risks and couldn't plan properly. He once said, "Patton is a thruster who doesn't know when to stop thrusting." Patton considered Montgomery a pompous coward who was afraid to fight. He wrote in his diary, "Monty is a tired little fart. War requires the taking of risks. He won't take them." Their clashes created problems for Eisenhower, who had to manage both. The most famous clash came in January 1945, after the Battle of the Bulge. Montgomery held a press conference where he implied British forces had saved the Americans from German counterattack. Patton exploded. He threatened to publicly call Montgomery a coward. Eisenhower had to intervene personally. Churchill was caught in the middle. Montgomery was British. Patton was American. Allied unity required supporting both publicly while managing them privately. Churchill's solution was pragmatic. Use each commander for what he did best. Montgomery for set-piece battles requiring careful planning. D-Day landings, Rhine crossing, final assault into Germany. Patton for exploitation and aggressive advance. Breakout from Normandy, advance across France. Relief of Bastogne during the Bulge. What Montgomery got right. It's easy to criticize Montgomery, but he wasn't wrong about everything. Casualties matter. Britain had lost nearly 1 million men in World War I, the entire generation of young men decimated. Montgomery's caution came from a genuine desire to avoid repeating that tragedy. Planning prevents disasters. D-Day succeeded partly because of Montgomery's meticulous planning. The Normandy landings could have been a catastrophe if poorly planned. Consolidation is necessary. Patton's aggressive advances sometimes left his flanks exposed and supply lines overstretched. Montgomery's insistence on consolidating gains prevented potential disasters. Set-piece battles require preparation. When attacking prepared defenses, Montgomery's approach worked. El Alamein proved that. Montgomery's problem wasn't his methods. It was applying those methods to situations where they didn't fit. Market Garden failed because it required speed and improvisation, Montgomery's weaknesses. If Montgomery had been honest about the operation's requirements, he might have recognized it wasn't suited to his command style. What Patton got right. Patton's aggressive approach had significant advantages. Speed prevents enemy recovery. German forces after Normandy were disorganized and retreating. Patton's relentless advance prevented them from establishing new defensive lines. Aggression creates psychological advantage. German commanders feared Patton specifically. They respected Montgomery, but feared Patton. Fear is a weapon. Exploitation wins wars. Breakthrough is one thing. Exploitation is what turns breakthrough into victory. Patton excelled at exploitation. Initiative matters. Patton's forces constantly attacked, forcing German forces to react. Reactive forces make mistakes. Proactive forces control the battle. But Patton had weaknesses too. His supply problems were partly self-inflicted. His advances were so fast that logistics couldn't keep up. Sometimes he had to stop not because of enemy action, but because his tanks ran out of gas. His abrasive personality created unnecessary conflicts. Better relationships with other commanders might have gotten him more resources and support. His tendency to disobey orders when he disagreed created problems for Eisenhower's overall strategy. Churchill's verdict. In his memoirs written after the war, Churchill carefully avoided directly criticizing Montgomery. British national pride required presenting Montgomery as a great general. But Churchill's private papers and conversations reveal his true assessment. Montgomery is Britain's finest defensive general and excellent planner. But the fluid warfare of 1944 and 45 required different qualities. Patton possessed those qualities. Churchill also made this observation. Wars are won by taking calculated risks. Montgomery calculates but rarely risks. Patton risks but rarely calculates. Eisenhower's challenge was getting them to work together. The closest Churchill came to public criticism was a comment he made to the War Cabinet in January 1945. We must recognize that American commanders have shown great initiative in fluid operations. We should learn from their approach. This was Churchill speak for Patton's methods work better than Montgomery's in current conditions. The broader lesson. The Montgomery-Patton comparison teaches important lessons about military leadership. No single approach works for every situation. Montgomery's methodical planning worked at El Alamein and D-Day. Patton's aggressive exploitation worked in France and Germany. Different situations require different approaches. Personality affects performance. Montgomery's caution came partly from concern about casualties, admirable but sometimes paralyzing. Patton's aggression came partly from ego, problematic but often effective. Resource allocation matters. When Eisenhower gave Montgomery resources for Market Garden, those resources weren't available for Patton. The decision to support Montgomery's plan prevented Patton from exploiting German weakness elsewhere. Timing is everything. In September 1944, German forces were retreating and disorganized. This was the moment for aggressive exploitation. Patton's strength. Montgomery's careful set-piece battle gave Germans time to recover and organize defenses. Casualties aren't the only measure of success. Montgomery's focus on minimizing casualties was admirable, but sometimes accepting moderate casualties in aggressive operations prevents higher casualties later by ending the war faster. The counterfactual. What if Patton had gotten the resources? Military historians have long debated, what if Eisenhower had supported Patton instead of Montgomery in September 1944? What if all the resources devoted to Market Garden, airborne divisions, supplies, air support, had gone to Patton's Third Army instead? The argument for this alternative. Patton was already advancing into Germany. With adequate supplies, he might have crossed the Rhine in September or October, months before it actually happened. German forces were disorganized and retreating. Aggressive pursuit might have prevented them from establishing the defensive lines that prolonged the war into 1945. The Siegfried Line fortifications weren't fully manned in September. Patton might have breached them before they were properly defended. The argument against Patton's supply lines were already overstretched. More resources might not have solved the fundamental logistics problem of advancing faster than supplies could move. German forces would have concentrated against Patton's advance just as they concentrated against Market Garden. He might have faced the same SS Panzer divisions. Patton's aggressive style created exposed flanks. A major German counterattack could have been catastrophic. We'll never know. But Churchill's assessment suggests he thought Patton's approach offered better chances of ending the war quickly. December 1944. The Bulge proves Patton right. December 16, 1944. Germany launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes. American forces were caught completely off guard. Entire divisions were surrounded. German panzers advanced rapidly. The Allied front line was shattered. Eisenhower called an emergency conference. American commanders were told, hold what you can. Organize defensive lines. Wait for reinforcements. Patton said, I'll attack. Every other commander stared at him. Attack? The Germans were attacking. American forces were retreating and surrounded. How could Patton attack? I'll wheel the Third Army 90 degrees north and hit the German flank, Patton said. We'll be attacking within 48 hours. Eisenhower and the other commanders were skeptical. Wheeling an entire army, over 200,000 men, 90 degrees, and attacking in a different direction within 48 hours? Impossible. Patton did it in 72 hours. December 19th, 3 days after the German attack began. Patton's Third Army attacked north into the German flank. This wasn't a limited counterattack. This was a full army assault. By December 22nd, Patton's forces had relieved Bastogne where the 101st Airborne was surrounded. By December 26th, the German advance was stopped. By January, The Bulge was eliminated. Patton's aggressive response to the Bulge demonstrated everything Churchill admired about his approach. Speed? Patton reacted faster than anyone thought possible. Aggression. While others were defensive, Patton attacked. Initiative. He didn't wait for orders or perfect conditions. He saw an opportunity and exploited it. Improvisation, changing an army's direction of attack mid-campaign, required incredible flexibility. Montgomery's response to the Bulge? He commanded American forces in the northern sector. His approach was characteristically cautious. Establish defensive lines, wait for German momentum to stall, then counterattack methodically. It worked. But Patton's aggressive approach worked faster and more decisively. Churchill noted this. The Bulge reinforced his assessment that Patton's style was better suited to the current phase of the war. March 1945, crossing the Rhine. The final comparison came in March 1945, when Allied forces crossed the Rhine River into Germany. Montgomery planned Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine near Wesel. Massive operation, weeks of preparation, over 250,000 troops, massive artillery bombardment, airborne assault, everything Montgomery loved. The operation launched March 23, 1945. It succeeded. Allied forces established a bridgehead and advanced into Germany. But 3 days earlier, March 22, Patton had already crossed the Rhine. No massive preparation, no elaborate planning. Patton's forces found a damaged but usable bridge at Oppenheim. They crossed immediately, established a bridgehead, expanded it. Then Patton called Eisenhower, "We've crossed the Rhine. Don't tell anyone yet. I want to surprise Montgomery." Patton's Rhine crossing used a fraction of the resources Montgomery's required, achieved the same objective 3 days earlier. Churchill heard about both operations. His comment to his staff: Montgomery takes 3 weeks and an army to cross a river. Patton takes 3 hours and finds a bridge. It was vintage Churchill, cutting, accurate, and fundamentally correct. The final verdict. So what did Churchill really say about Montgomery losing 10,000 men while Patton took 12 cities? The actual quote, "Montgomery requires an army. Patton requires only a map and gasoline," wasn't about one specific operation. It was Churchill's summary of the fundamental difference between the two commanders. But Churchill understood both were necessary. Montgomery's careful planning made D-Day possible. His methodical approach cleared the Scheldt and opened Antwerp. His set-piece crossing of the Rhine was textbook military planning. Patton's aggressive exploitation turned the Normandy breakout into a rout. His rapid advance across France prevented German recovery. His relief of Bastogne saved the Bulge. Churchill's genius was recognizing that different commanders excel in different situations. The challenge was using each commander where his strengths mattered most. Where Eisenhower sometimes failed, supporting Montgomery's market garden instead of Patton's exploitation, Churchill saw clearly. Late 1944 was Patton's kind of war. By the numbers. Montgomery's operations. September-December 1944. Approximately 30,000 casualties, limited territorial gains, some strategic objectives achieved at high cost. Patton's operation, same period. Approximately 15,000 casualties, extensive territorial gains, multiple cities captured, continuous pressure on German forces. Churchill's assessment was based on results. Patton delivered more with less, Montgomery delivered less with more. That's not a moral judgment, it's a tactical assessment. The human cost. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Behind every casualty statistic are families destroyed, futures erased, potential unrealized. Montgomery's concern about casualties came from genuine compassion. He'd served in World War I, watched an entire generation slaughtered. He was determined not to repeat that bloodbath. Patton's aggressive approach accepted higher casualties in individual battles because he believed speed would end the war faster and save lives overall. Who was right? It's impossible to say definitively. We can't run the experiment twice, but we can observe. Patton's aggressive operations in late 1944, if fully supported, instead of Montgomery's Market Garden, might have ended the European war months earlier. How many lives would that have saved? Soldiers and civilians, Holocaust victims, POWs, everyone suffering under Nazi occupation. Churchill's frustration with Montgomery wasn't about heartlessness. It was about strategic assessment. Montgomery's caution might have prolonged the war and thereby increased total casualties. Lessons for today. The Montgomery-Patton comparison remains relevant for modern military thinking. Match commanders to situations. Don't assume one approach works everywhere. Identify what the situation requires, then use commanders whose strengths match those requirements. Speed matters in fluid situations. When the enemy is disorganized, aggressive exploitation prevents recovery. Caution allows reorganization and prolongs conflict. Resource allocation is strategy. Eisenhower's decision to support Market Garden meant not supporting Patton. Every resource given to one operation is taken from another. Personality affects military effectiveness. Montgomery's caution and Patton's aggression came from personality as much as military doctrine. Understanding commanders' psychology matters. There's no perfect general. Montgomery and Patton both had significant weaknesses. The art is using their strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. Public narrative differs from private assessment. Churchill publicly supported Montgomery for political reasons, while privately preferring Patton's approach. Leaders often have to balance truth with morale and alliance management. Conclusion: Churchill's wisdom. Winston Churchill's assessment, Montgomery requires an army. Patton requires only a map and gasoline, wasn't just a clever quip. It was profound military insight. Montgomery represented traditional military thinking, careful planning, overwhelming force, methodical execution. This approach works when you have time to prepare and can concentrate resources. Patton represented modern mobile warfare, speed, aggression, exploitation, adaptation. This approach works when situations are fluid and opportunities appear and disappear quickly. In late 1944, Germany was collapsing. The situation was fluid. Opportunities appeared daily. This was Patton's war. Montgomery's Market Garden, careful planning, massive resources, slow execution, was exactly wrong for the situation. It gave German forces time to recover and organize defenses. Patton's exploitation, aggressive advance, rapid adaptation, continuous pressure was exactly right for the situation. It kept German forces off balance and prevented recovery. Churchill saw this clearly. His frustration was that political and alliance management concerns prevented fully acting on his assessment. The numbers tell the story. Montgomery: more resources, higher casualties, less achievement. Patton: fewer resources, lower casualties, more achievement. Churchill's verdict: in the war's final year, when aggressive exploitation mattered most, Patton was the superior commander. That doesn't diminish Montgomery's earlier achievements, El Alamein, D-Day. These required exactly Montgomery's strengths, but it recognizes reality. Different phases of war require different approaches. Great leaders match commanders to circumstances. Churchill understood this. His private assessment of Montgomery and Patton reflects the wisdom of a leader who understood both war and human nature. Montgomery requires an army. Patton requires only a map and gasoline. 12 words that capture the fundamental truth about two commanders, two approaches, And what wins wars when the enemy is collapsing and opportunities are fleeting? Churchill knew. History proved him right.